we have Eddie Trask. He is a local here, California refugee. He's a former wine marketer. He wrote his first book, Confession All, in 2020, and is working on a second book about the Reformation. He's a first-year student at the Augustine Institute, studying for a master's in theology. He speaks one language. That's good. But yeah, he's been a pleasure to meet Eddie and chat with him, and has become a great friend. And our wives love to hang out together, so it's an honor to introduce Eddie Trask.
Before I start, I just want to thank Travis and Johnny and Salt and Light Radio and just everyone that has put this together. It's an honor to just be included and to be able to share my story. I'm going to keep this testimony like Travis, short and not very funny. And also, if I get through this without crying, I heard that Father Larry is going to buy a hamburger for everyone in attendance. So for what that's worth. So, I was born in 1982. I was baptized in 83. I received First Holy Communion in 1990. And that same year, I became an altar server. And then I was confirmed in 1998. In 2001, I was in college and was already immersed in that lifestyle and definitely far from the church. At best, I attended Mass every other month. I unworthily received the Holy Eucharist. I rarely prayed, and I never went to confession. There were parties, recreational drugs, and hours of mindless computer and television viewing. Plus, there was blackout drunkenness, pornography, fornication. I was a mess, but I was a hidden mess, a con man, really. Even after I met my wife, I continued in much of my messiness. At that point, my secrecy radically increased. It was okay for friends to know who I was, partially, but certainly not my wife, Ashley. She was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, left her church when she was a teenager, and had since been a non-denominational evangelical. She asked me about my Catholic beliefs a few times, and I had no response, only hostility. I believed what I believed because it was what I was taught. However, when it came time for us to decide what church to attend, it was a matter of which non-denominational church it would be, because for some reason Catholicism was out of question. A year after our marriage, we found ourselves jumping from church to church, checking out worship style, pastor sermon style, congregation friendliness, etc. Meanwhile, I jumped from job to job, claiming it was all about climbing the corporate ladder and not about my search for meaning. Eventually, we settled on a church that everyone seemed to be talking about. The pastor's sermons were so relatable. I had never heard such conviction in my life. It was entertaining. I was constantly laughing. I thought the pastor was awesome. I responded to several altar calls over the years and even got in the baptismal tank, believing my infant baptism was somehow needless or ineffective. But none of these actions changed me, even though it was implied that they would. Drunkenness and pornography remained among many other incessant patterns of lying, anxiety, depression, selfishness, and victimhood. This was at a time where I'd never had a better job, never had a better title, never had better pay, never had better clout. Thankfully, only 6 months later, God decided to put an end to the old Eddie. It was time for his intervention. This is where my book, Confessional, begins. Tuesday, September 5th, 2017, 8:15 a.m. You will confess to your wife, the Holy Spirit commanded, commencing hell on earth. It was a typical late summer morning at Alston Park. Dozens of birds chirped while curious dogs explored off leash Cabernet grapes sunbathed on lush hillsides, and hot air balloons playfully rose and descended. To Napa Valley tourists and natives, this was heaven. A disruption to such tranquility would be criminal. Once confess struck my spirit, I felt a few feet shy of an aneurysm. The rhythm of my walk, often set by prayer, died. My thoughts ceased. My legs awkwardly shuffled. I knew this was not a howl of a guilt-ridden conscience. Neither angels nor demons were perched on my shoulders, taking turns whispering in my ears. The encounter was beyond comprehension. So this began a tormented 2-year process. Once I started confessing to my wife, I reached to turn off my faucet of memories, and its handle snapped off in my hand. This is how my scrupulosity began. And I'll say that this type of scrupulosity between husband and wife is beyond words. Suddenly, I viewed temptations as venial sins and venial sins as mortal sins. But because at the time we were Protestant, I couldn't articulate any of this. Confession to a priest wasn't even a thought. Catholicism was dead to me. I didn't know what to do other than persist in what I felt God was permitting. The mania of feeling convicted to share every single sin and temptation, past and present, coupled with my wife's hesitant yet overwhelming curiosity, was surely a recipe for disaster. I cannot capture the emotions or the feelings with words. If you've ever betrayed your spouse, you may know what I'm talking about. My nature wanted to play the victim and focus on all of my wife's shortcomings. My carnality wanted to morph me into a poor, deprived child, and my instincts wanted me to run like a coward. At my worst, I felt a few inches away from mental collapse. Meanwhile, my wife was constantly spiritually attacked by images, words, and dreams. It was betrayal followed by a trip to purgatory. However, somehow, in some mysterious way, no matter what was happening, no matter how dark and bleak the moments became, God always lifted us up. He always kept us present, always. He was whispering to both of us the entire time. He was keeping Ashley calm and collected, and was often telling me in a gentle voice, let her talk, or this is good, or just a simple apologize. As we sat in nausea and numbness for well over a year, God held our hands. It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He didn't leave us alone in the fire. We were being scorched, no doubt. However, when wounds appeared, he always taught us a lesson. Even if it took months, the lessons were eventually learned and applied. Healing was happening in the most frustrating, miraculous, and unpredictable way. Fast forward, now 16 months into the journey, 16 months into scrupulosity, 16 months of working on our marriage, over 16 months of unemployment. Time stopped. On Friday, February 8th, the flu gripped me. Miserable in quarantine for half a day, I eventually went to bed around 8:30 and found myself still awake at 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, 12:30. Every passing hour, reviving traumas of the past year and a half. I just wanted to sleep. Desperate, I counted sheep, alternating from small to large, cartoon to real. They were helping, kind of. However, at 1:30 a.m., I was wide awake. By then, I was overcome with emotion, praying in intervals of 10 to 20 seconds, then losing focus and getting thrown back into wretched torment. God intervened just after 2 o'clock. It wasn't peaceful. Like his confrontation at Alston Park, it was a takeover that left me uneasy. He wasn't saying, confess to your wife, or rest, or stay where you are. Instead, I felt called to continue researching Christian history, specifically Catholicism. The impression was like a log rammed into my already stick-laden bicycle spoke. Still, I fought these overpowering feelings for at least a half hour before I got out of bed to use the restroom. I closed the door and began sobbing, asking God what he wanted from me. My nose and eyes were streaming as I leaned over the toilet. Father, I will do whatever you need me to do. Please help me. I don't know what's going on. You want me to explore Christianity further? I thought I thought I was doing that. Why is everything so confusing? You see, at this point, I had been studying various Protestant denominations for about 3 months, initially prompted by some of Ashley's doctrinal questions. She was confused about a guest speaker who had contradicted what our pastor had said the week before. She and I wanted to understand who was right and why. Sadly, up to that point, most of my life had consisted of going through the motions. First Catholicism, then Protestantism. Consequently, I was clueless about Christian history. Finally, as I sought to answer Ashley's questions in a new set of my own, I traced many non-denominational churches to Pentecostal and charismatic movements. And then I traced Ashley's Adventist upbringing to Baptist movements. Then I explored Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian teachings. Then I found myself comparing Calvinism, Arminianism, and Molinism. I followed what I thought was a logical progression from one fork and one splinter to another. However, through it all, there was a blockade, making the year 1517 seem light years from 1516. It seemed Christ had been crucified in the 16th century, so once I arrived at the early Reformer years, I felt I had gone as far as I needed, yet I didn't know what to do next. Only a day earlier, I had watched a fascinating John MacArthur sermon series titled Saved or Self-Deceived. Still, as much as I nodded my head in agreement, I wasn't fully convinced of anything. No matter how upstream I swam, Catholicism was out of the picture. Until that February night, when another blindfold fell and dozens of light bulbs flashed, I could not push past this Reformation wall. It was massive and fortified with centuries of stacked defenses, games of telephone, deliberate propaganda and omission, proof texting, rejection of authority, confused laity, and darkness cleverly and purposefully weaved into pictures, words, and traditions. Church scandal, coupled with one man's decisive renouncement of specific actions, meant the baby, the bathwater, and the house itself needed to be thrown out. If not immediately, then over time. Along with exploring the early church fathers, the puzzle pieces of Christian history finally came together. God had removed my blindness. Mentally, I was on my way back to the church. It took an additional 2 months before my heart joined the journey. At first, Ashley was livid with my newfound convictions, and drawing on her own experiences, she spent quite some time debating me. After a while, she started secretly researching on her own, dead set on proving me wrong. This inevitably led to some heavy-duty questions. I would find what were, in my opinion, ironclad answers, hoping to end the debates and convince her of Catholicism. But no matter how good the answers appeared to me, although she might accept them as possibilities, she would still come right back with tons of questions. And how did I often respond? With childish frustration. Through a lack of patience and understanding, I was doing what any evangelist or apologist should never do. Assume that the other person has already experienced the paradigm shift required to comprehend and assent to the teachings of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. This can only happen with the Holy Spirit. Despite it all, 6 months later, convinced of the legitimacy of St. Peter and apostolic succession, Ashley enrolled in RCIA. A month later, I received the sacrament of reconciliation, our marriage was convalidated, and our children were baptized into the Catholic Church. A few days later, just before we moved to Idaho in August of 2019, Ashley turned to me and said, "You claimed that God confronted you 2 years ago. I've watched him work on you this whole time. I've actually seen the fruit myself. You're a completely different man. And you claimed God did it again and led you to Catholicism. If I hadn't seen you change so dramatically, I would have never taken you seriously. I never would have been willing to even consider Catholicism. But because I've watched you obey God every single time, even when it looked absolutely insane, I trust you. Your obedience is the only reason I'm here." A day after that, my scrupulosity ended. So, all the filth, the dysfunction, the grave sins, the flesh, it's all out there. I stand before anyone who has read my book with nothing to hide. For some, it's comical. For others, it's stupid. And for some, it's just a guy who constantly needs God's grace. When I was called out of darkness, I knew God wanted me to do the ridiculous in the eyes of the world and to expose the ridiculous. This, however, is not heroic, especially when there lie many consequences in one's wake. This is simply a duty of man, to take off the mask, to be known without fig leaves, to be transparent and vulnerable and fight for the way, the truth, and the life. In hindsight, every second of suffering was worth it for both of us. Every sleepless night, every spiritual attack, every repeated mistake, every tormented dream, every nauseous episode, all of it was worth it. The Lord calls us to die to self, each in our own way, so that we may discover his will. In my case, he placed great focus on chastity and obedience. Gentlemen, while God may not permit many to endure such scrupulous insanity, he does call all of us to the sacrament of reconciliation, one of the most amazing gifts ever given to the church. No matter what you've done, what you've said, what you're currently struggling with, you're not too far gone. Don't let shame or pride keep you from the Lord's arms. He's calling all his children home. I'll end with Ephesians 5:11 through 17. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is a shame even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, it is said, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. God bless you all.